After operationally defining a behavior, conducting a functional behavior assessment, as well as a preference assessment, the next step is to determine what intervention to implement. The next 3 modules will introduce a variety of interventions and how to select them. In this module, we will introduce consequence-based interventions. Consequence-based interventions are interventions that occur after the behavior, rather than on what precedes the behavior. This involves identifying consequences for the behavior, such as withholding reinforcement for the inappropriate behavior or providing reinforcement for a more appropriate alternative behavior. A variety of consequence-based interventions are available to decrease or eliminate challenging behaviors. Some interventions, such as extinction or punishment, are based on withholding reinforcement or presenting punishers for the inappropriate behavior. Other interventions based on differential reinforcement, such as differential reinforcement of alternative behaviors, functional communication training, or differential reinforcement of other behaviors, are amongst the most widely used and effective intervention procedures. First, we are going to describe extinction and punishment procedures, which are based on withholding reinforcement or presenting punishers for inappropriate behaviors. Using extinction for problem behavior happens when reinforcement of a previously reinforced behavior is discontinued. As a result, the behavior should decrease in frequency, that is, how often it happens, and in intensity and in duration. Withholding reinforcement in this case is said to break the functional relationship between a behavior and its consequence. Using our ABC model, we can see that a student's inappropriate vocalizations appear to be maintained by escape from the task. A natural reaction when a student engages in a challenging behavior when presented with demands is to back off or offer a break. While this is likely to stop the behavior in the short run, the individual is likely to learn that those behaviors delay or eliminate situations that are aversive to him or her. Using extinction to diminish the inappropriate vocalizations consists in this case of continuing to present the task. For example, providing prompts or waiting until compliance occurs. Here, the problem behavior does not produce the removal of any aversive stimulus and is expected to therefore decrease. To implement an extinction procedure, you will first need to define the problem behavior and the conditions under which it occurs. You will then need to identify what is maintaining the problem behavior using a functional behavior assessment. Depending on what is maintaining the problem behavior, you will need to plan the type of extinction that will be used, such as withholding attention for the behavior or preventing escape or automatic reinforcement. Please note that an extinction procedure will look different depending on the function of behavior. If the problem behavior is maintained by attention, the individual should receive no attention for engaging in the problem behavior. Problem behavior that is maintained by escape from demands should result in keeping up with the demands if the problem behavior occurs. And problem behavior maintained by access to tangible items should no longer result in allowing access to that tangible item. For example, if a problem behavior such as screaming is determined to be maintained by attention, specifically by requesting to be quiet every time the behavior occurs, implementing extinction in this case will consist of ignoring the problem behavior each time it occurs. It is important to note that for extinction to work, it has to be implemented consistently. If behavior sometimes results in reinforcement, for example, from people who don't know about the procedure, it is less likely for that behavior to go away. Another important point is to make sure that you have control over the reinforcer. To determine if extinction is an applicable procedure for a specific problem behavior, you will have to make sure that you can prevent reinforcing that problem behavior. Attention from peers, for example, is a powerful reinforcer that is very often difficult to control. Finally, note that extinction is not always ignoring the person. If the behavior is maintained by escape from demands, ignoring or excluding the person would make that situation worse. In other terms, it would reinforce that behavior. When you are dealing with escape-maintained behavior, Implementing an extinction procedure would consist of keeping those demands in place and not allowing for escape from the activity. When a behavior is slow to decrease, it is said to be more resistant to extinction. When implementing extinction, it is important to know that the longer the behavior has been reinforced in the past, the longer it will take for it to be extinguished. Furthermore, a behavior that has been intermittently reinforced in the past will take longer to extinguish compared to a behavior that has been continually reinforced. For example, one morning your car doesn't start. If, in the past, your car didn't always start right away, you may be more likely to try and start it for a longer period of time compared to a car that does start all the time. In this case, when you are trying to start the car, you're being more persistent or more resistant to extinction. This also explains why consistency is important while implementing extinction. If reinforcement occurs from time to time because of a failure to carry out the extinction procedure, then the behavior will be more persistent in the long run. Behavior undergoing extinction is usually associated with an extinction burst. An extinction burst happens when, following the removal of the reinforcer, there is an immediate increase in the frequency, duration, or intensity of the behavior. Problem behavior will happen to get worse before it improves. For example, a child who gets up frequently crying at night might receive attention in the form of comfort or reassurance. If the parents decide to put this behavior on extinction and therefore withhold attention, the child cries might initially become more intense or last longer. They might be accompanied by more significant behavior. While this is a sign that extinction is working, it is important to anticipate this effect in order to be consistent and be prepared to continue withholding reinforcement during this extinction burst. Note that using extinction as a single procedure is generally prescribed for problem behaviors such as disruption or mild forms of aggression. Given extinction effects, do not use it alone for aggressive behaviors towards self or others. However, this procedure is often used in combination with reinforcement-based procedures that we will describe later in this module. While extinction is an intervention that has clear benefits, such as breaking the functional relationship between a behavior and its consequence, it does not teach a more appropriate behavior. It can also be difficult to implement and requires a high level of fidelity to be effective. Furthermore, temporary increases of problem behavior or aggression can make this intervention contraindicated when the problem behavior is dangerous for the individual or others. Other procedures based on the removal of reinforcers or presentation of punishment are interventions based on punishment. Remember that punishment occurs when consequences following a behavior result in the decrease of the frequency of that future behavior. Positive punishment occurs when the behavior decreases after it is followed by an aversive event. For example, putting your hand on the hot stove is less likely to occur again because it is very painful. Negative punishment, on the other hand, happens when a behavior decreases after the removal of a reinforcing stimulus or event. For example, a child who has a toy taken away after hitting a sibling might be less likely to engage in that behavior in the future. Interventions based on negative punishment, which consist of removing the reinforcer upon the occurrence of a problem behavior, that will be described next are timeout from positive reinforcement and response cost. Timeout from positive reinforcement consists of placing an individual in a less rewarding situation when he or she engages in problem behavior. Timeout from positive reinforcement is effective for behavior maintained by positive reinforcement, such as the access to attention or tangibles. Timeout should not be used for behavior maintained by escape, as it is likely to reinforce that behavior. One consideration is that timeout from positive reinforcement will only work if the activities or situations the individual is being removed from are actually valuable to that individual. Two types of timeout from positive reinforcement can be used. In the case of non-exclusionary timeout, the individual is not completely removed from the situation, but the reinforcer is withheld following problem behavior. Non-exclusionary timeout can be implemented by removing toys or withholding attention for a brief period of time. In the case of exclusionary timeout, the individual is removed from the environment for a specific amount of time upon the occurrence of problem behavior. In this case, the individual will lose access to all forms of positive reinforcement. To implement a timeout procedure, you will first need to make sure that the behavior is maintained by attention or access to tangibles, as this procedure is not effective with escape-maintained behavior. You will also need to precisely define the behavior leading to timeout and decide if the timeout will be exclusionary or non-exclusionary. Finally, you will need to determine the duration of the timeout as well as an exit criteria, such as improved behavior. Response cost, another procedure based on removing reinforcers, consists of the removal of a specific amount of reinforcement already held by the individual following the occurrence of a problem behavior. Examples of reinforcers that can be used in a response cost intervention are money or tokens or tangibles such as the toys or tablet, or even activities such as going to recess or to the movies. To implement a response cost procedure, you will need to define the behavior leading to the loss of reinforcer, as well as the reinforcer that is lost and in what amount. Before implementing this procedure, you will need to make sure that the delay between the problem behavior and the loss of the reinforcer is appropriate for the individual. For young children or individuals with severe developmental disabilities, it is best to have an immediate reinforcer loss. Next, we will review several procedures based on positive punishment. These are overcorrection, contingent exercise, guided compliance, and response blocking. Overcorrection is an intervention based on positive punishment, where the individual is required to engage in an effortful behavior that is directly or logically related to the problem behavior, contingent on each instance of the problem behavior. Two different types of correction procedure will be presented next: restitution and positive practice. Restitution is an overcorrection procedure where the individual is required to repair the damage caused by a problem behavior. Specifically, the individual is required to return the environment to its original state, as well as put it in better shape than it was prior to the problem behavior. For example, if an individual throws a cup of juice on the floor, he would be required to wipe the juice up, as well as clean the entire floor. A second type of overcorrection consists of requiring the individual to engage in positive practice of the appropriate behavior. In this case, the individual might be required to practice a correct behavior multiple times every time they engage in problem behavior. An example of this is a student who frequently runs in the hallway. You may require them to walk the hallway 5 times in a row for every time they run it. Guided compliance, which is another procedure based on positive punishment, can be used when an individual is asked to complete a task or perform an action. In the case of problem behavior, the individual will be physically guided to complete the required task. For example, an individual who exhibits problem behavior when they are asked to make their bed at night may be physically guided to perform that action. Response blocking is a positive punishment procedure that prevents an individual from engaging in a problem behavior by intervening as soon as the individual begins to emit that response. Using minimal restraint, this procedure can be useful for dangerous or harmful behaviors such as throwing objects, hitting, or self-injurious behaviors. Even if punishment procedures, and in particular interventions based on punishment procedures, are described here, they present certain side effects that restrict their applicability and pose ethical concerns. In particular, it is important to note that positive punishment interventions can induce emotional or aggressive reactions. They can increase escape and avoidance responses of the participant. Furthermore, misusing or overusing these procedures might harm the participant. As a result, before considering using punishment-based procedures, it is critical to use reinforcement-based procedures first. Timeout and response cost should always be used in combination with reinforcement procedures. While procedures based on punishment can significantly decrease problem behavior, it is important to take into consideration that they do not teach any appropriate behavior. Furthermore, They present several side effects that limit their application and can be misused or overused. When using consequence-based strategies, it is recommended to always use procedures that are based on reinforcement, and only use punishment procedures as a last resort. Interventions based on differential reinforcement, such as differential reinforcement of alternative behaviors, DRA, differential reinforcement of incompatible behaviors, DRI, or differential reinforcement of other behaviors, or DRO, are amongst the most widely used and effective procedures. Next, we will review procedures based on differential reinforcement of alternative behaviors, functional communication training, and differential reinforcement of other behaviors. Using differential reinforcement involves reinforcing one behavior or a class of behaviors while withholding reinforcement for another behavior. Typically, when attempting to decrease problem behaviors, it consists of minimizing or eliminating reinforcement for the problem behavior while providing reinforcement for a more appropriate behavior. Next, we will review the most common forms of differential reinforcement. Another consequence-based intervention that involves differential reinforcement is the differential reinforcement of other behaviors, or DRO. Here, rather than targeting a specific alternative behavior, this procedure involves delivering reinforcement if the problem behavior has not occurred during a specific time period. This procedure is also called differential reinforcement of zero responding, since the goal is to reinforce the absence of problem behavior. It teaches that the behavior will no longer result in reinforcement, while still giving access to the reinforcer after the behavior has not been omitted for a certain amount of time. In order to implement a DRO procedure, you will need to first operationally define the behavior and the conditions under which it occurs, as well as identify what reinforcer is maintaining the behavior. You will then need to decide on whether momentary or interval DRO will be used, as well as define the reinforcer and how often you will deliver that. Any display of inappropriate behavior results in resetting the clock or omitting reinforcement for that period of time. Note that the DRO procedure will look different depending on the function of behavior. If the problem behavior is maintained by attention, the individual receives attention only if no problem behavior occurred during the interval. Problem behavior maintained by escape from demands will result in a break only if no problem behavior occurred during that interval. And finally, for problem behavior maintained by access to tangibles, the individual earns access to the item only if problem behavior has not occurred during that interval. So how do you determine the interval duration? Initially, it should be pretty frequent. To determine the interval, use the baseline data. The interval should be equal or slightly lower than the mean inter-response time, or IRT. This is to decrease the likelihood that the individual engages in problem behavior before receiving reinforcement. To calculate the mean IRT, simply divide the observation period duration by the number of problem behavior occurrences. So, how do you determine the interval duration? Initially, it should be set so that it results in frequent reinforcement. To determine this interval, use the baseline data. The interval should be equal or slightly lower than the mean inter-response time, or IRT. This is to decrease the likelihood that the individual engages in problem behavior before receiving reinforcement. To calculate the mean IRT, simply divide the observation period, duration, by the number of problem behavior occurrences. For example, Mason makes inappropriate comments towards other students an average of 10 times per hour. A DRO intervention is planned. To calculate the mean IRT, divide the observation period, which is 60 minutes, by the average number of times he engages in problem behavior. Mason engages in problem behavior around every 3 minutes on average. So to ensure frequent reinforcement, the interval of time during which no problem behavior should occur should be set under 3 minutes. Differential reinforcement of other behaviors is a useful procedure that can decrease problem behavior by providing access to reinforcement at regular intervals in the absence of problem behavior. It can be effectively used to increase tolerance to an aversive situation without putting access to reinforcement in the individual's control. As with other differential reinforcement procedures, period of access to reinforcement might be difficult to manage, and decreasing rate of reinforcement sometimes requires supervision in order to be effective. DRA stands for Differential Reinforcement of Alternative Behaviors. In this case, it consists of providing reinforcement for a more desirable or appropriate behavior while withholding reinforcement for the less desirable, challenging behavior. This results in an increase in the future probability of the desired behavior and a decrease in the occurrence of the challenging behavior. The purpose is to substitute an appropriate response for the inappropriate response. Using our ABC model, we can take the example of a student being disruptive during math lessons by frequently standing up from his chair. Every time the child stands up, the teacher tells him to sit down. A functional analysis confirms that this behavior is maintained by attention in the form of frequent reprimands from the teacher. Applying the DRA in this situation would involve withholding attention for standing up while frequently providing attention for a more desired behavior, such as, for example, sitting down or completing work. When planning for this intervention, use a functional behavior assessment to identify the function of behavior. That is, whether attention, access to tangibles, or escape is maintaining the problem behavior. A second step in planning this intervention will be to define the alternative behavior. You will also need to determine the consequence for the omission of the problem behavior. While implementing the DRA, extinction, that is, withholding the reinforcer when the problem behavior is omitted, is often a necessary component to ensure a greater and faster decrease in problem behavior. However, some conditions might preclude the use of extinction. An example of these behaviors might be self-injury or severe aggressive behaviors. If you are not using extinction, be sure to provide a better or a greater amount of reinforcement when the appropriate behavior is omitted compared to when the problem behavior is omitted. This will help shift the balance toward the desirable behavior. Finally, you will need to define the reinforcer, define its magnitude, as well as how often it will be delivered. Initially, plan to deliver the reinforcer frequently or every time the alternative behavior is omitted. The individual should already demonstrate the alternative behavior, even at low levels. The alternative behavior should require equal or less effort than the problem behavior. And finally, it's important to pick a behavior that is likely to be reinforced in the natural environment. DRA procedures look slightly different depending on the function of behavior. For example, problem behavior maintained by attention, the individual should receive attention after engaging in the alternative behavior. If access to tangibles is the function of the problem behavior, then the tangibles should only be delivered after the individual engages in that alternative behavior. And for escape, breaks from demands should be delivered contingent on the alternative behavior. Here is an example of the application of DRA for a problem behavior defined as elopement that has been determined to be maintained by escape from the instructional task. Data shows that this behavior happens every 40 minutes on average, most of the time resulting in 5-minute breaks from work. To implement DRA in this case, it is important to make sure that, initially, the appropriate behavior is reinforced before elopement has a chance to occur. To do so, reinforcement will need to be provided more frequently and at a better level than typically follows the problem behavior. Providing bigger, better reinforcement for the appropriate behavior will help shift the balance in favor of the more appropriate behavior and decrease the likelihood that the individual will engage in problem behavior. DRA is a very effective intervention that allows to decrease problem behavior while increasing the existing skill or teaching a new one. Its main advantage is that it allows individuals to keep accessing reinforcement. Take into consideration that since successful applications of this procedure require high rates of reinforcement to favor the alternative behavior, ongoing activities might initially be disrupted. Furthermore, some amount of expertise might be required in order to diminish access to reinforcement once the behavior is established. FCT stands for Functional Communication Training and is a specific form of DRA where the alternative desirable response is reinforced as a recognizable communication response, such as a vocalization, a sign, a picture, or a card that matches the function of the behavior. In order to be successful, the communicative response should be easy to engage in, for example, saying break or break please. For example, a student that is engaging in severe self-injurious behavior might get a break from work as a result. While this stops or diminishes the problem behavior in the short term, it also makes it more likely to happen in the future. This would establish a pattern of escape-maintained behavior. Implementing a functional communication training procedure in this case involves teaching an alternative, more appropriate communicative response, such as requesting a break and allowing escape contingent on that request. Implementing a functional communication training intervention requires you to first define how the behavior looks and the conditions under which it occurs. This will allow you to identify the reinforcer that maintains the problem behavior and select the appropriate communicative response that matches the function of the behavior. As for DRA, FCT procedures look slightly different depending on the function of behavior. For problem behavior that is maintained by attention, the individual should receive attention after engaging in the communicative response. If access to tangibles is the function of problem behavior, then the tangibles should only be delivered after the individual engages in the communicative response. And for problem behavior maintained by escape, breaks from demands should only be made available after the individual engages in the functional communication response. For example, using FCT for a problem behavior consisting of hitting peers maintained by escape from instruction would consist of teaching the individual to ask for help by handing a card. The communication response that you teach should initially be as simple as possible and should match the child's repertoire. Non-vocal individuals, for example, should be taught to engage in a communicative response that involves a picture exchange or an ASL signal. Importantly, the communicative response should provide access to the reinforcer identified during the functional assessment. For the escape function, the communicative response should be asking for a break, whereas for attention-maintained behavior, the communicative response should be to ask someone to play, for example. To teach the communicative response, you should initially give access to the reinforcement for each instance of the communicative response. If needed, prompt the response by helping the child and give access to the reinforcement immediately afterward. In the next video, you will see a demonstration of the initial functional communication training. In order to teach the use of the communication response, you'll need to create response opportunities. Depending on the function of problem behavior, this could be done by withdrawing attention, presenting demands, or removing access to a preferred item. In order to prevent the individual from engaging in the problem behavior, immediately prompt the communication response and give access to the specified reinforcer. If problem behavior occurs, be sure not to reinforce it.
Whoa, pretty great coloring. That's awesome. Okay, I have some work to do. Excuse me. Yeah, what's up? Are you coloring this awesome picture? High five, buddy. That's awesome. I love it. Okay, I'm going to keep working. Excuse me. Yeah, Max, what's up? What color did you do that?
In the next video, you will see how the therapist ignores problem behavior and reinforces the communication response.
Whoa, she is looking really cool. I really like that, buddy. Excuse me. Hey, what's up? That's what I drew. Oh, I love it. That's cool.
For some individuals, it might be necessary to gradually delay prompts by waiting a few seconds, as well as gradually fading physical prompts by diminishing the intrusiveness of the prompt until the individual shows independent responding. In the next video, you will first see a communication response that is prompted right away with a full physical prompt, which is hand over hand. The second part of the video will show prompting that is delayed for 5 seconds, as well as a less intrusive prompt in order to give an opportunity for the individual to respond independently.
Blue hair. Cool, you can have a break, no problem. Super fun. Yep, you get to hang out. Oh, it's gonna be such a good day today. Oh, I like your white shirt. Cool. All right, break's over. Touch green hair. Oh, cool, you can have a break. Thanks for asking. That was cool. Yep, we're just hanging out. It's super fun. Oh, I like your shoes. Those are so cool. Yeah, it's a fun day. Oh, time to work. Touch yellow hair. Oh, cool. Thanks for asking for a break. You can totally have a break. I love it. We're having so much fun, huh? Yeah, super cool. I love hanging out with you. It's really fun. Awesome. Oh, break's over. Time to work. Touch orange hair. Oh, sure. You can have a break. Nice asking. I like the way you're asking for those breaks. Super cool. We're just hanging out. It's a really fun day. It was really sunny today, huh? Oh, time to work. Touch orange hair. Cool. You can have a break. Awesome asking. Super awesome. We get to hang out. Oh, man. We're going to play. Really good job. You're doing so.
Several forms of communication responses can be taught, depending on the individual's repertoire. Types of responses range from picture card exchanges to pressing a button on a device or using ASL or a short statement.
All right, Max, it's time to work. Write your name. It's time to work. Write your name. Break. Oh, you want a break? Great. You can have a break. Okay, write your name. Break. All right. There you go. Take a break. Write your name, Max. Whoa, nice. You want to have a break. Awesome. Whoa, you want a snack. Awesome. Hey, nice job. You want a snack. They are
Training is a way to thin the reinforcement schedule by teaching the individual to request reinforcement only when it is available. When reinforcement is not available, the individual learns not to engage in the communication response or the problem behavior. Signals, such as color cards or bracelets, are used to let the individual know whether a request will be met with reinforcement. In the next video, you will see an example of signal training using color cards. In this instance, requests are only reinforced when the card is green. Requests made when the card is red are not reinforced.
Nice job asking on green. Good job.
but they are not available, one way to facilitate the waiting period is to provide another preferred activity, such as playing on the tablet or coloring.
Oh, you want to play? Okay, you have to wait. Thanks for waiting. Good job. Oh, thanks for turning that in. You have to wait. Good waiting. Here you go.
Reinforcer, which might be difficult to manage in certain environments. In order to stabilize the rate of the communication response, once the behavior has been established, expertise may be needed in order to determine how best to fade the access to that reinforcer. In summary, many interventions based on differential reinforcement are available. These interventions are effective in decreasing problem behavior while increasing appropriate behavior or communication. Ethical guidelines state that priority should be given to the least restrictive and least aversive interventions that produce meaningful results. Because they allow the individual to still access reinforcement, procedures based on differential reinforcement, such as DRA, FCT, or DRO, should be used first. Procedures based on extinction alone, which consists of terminating reinforcement, come next, as they do not provide reinforcement for alternative behaviors. Procedures based on punishment, such as timeout or response cost procedures, or overcorrection, are considered more aversive and likely to elicit emotional reactions or aggression, and as a result, should be considered as a last resort. To summarize, two main types of consequence-based interventions exist. Interventions based on withholding reinforcement or presenting punishers following problem behaviors such as extinction and punishment. Interventions based on delivering reinforcement for appropriate behavior, communication, or the absence of problem behavior such as DRA, FCT, or DRO. Lastly, one should always consider implementing reinforcement-based interventions before considering punitive interventions.